reptiles. The huge advancement with reptiles was the amniotic egg. Amniotic eggs meant that there was a little more protection from desiccation. There's a cushion for the embryo. It had a little bit better gas transfer. You could store your waste better. And what this meant was, as opposed to amphibians who were still, although they didn't have gills, but they were still tied to the water because most of them had to have their eggs in water, or at least kept moist at all times in order to develop. Reptiles didn't have that. So they could advance into other environments and habitats that were previously not invaded by the vertebrates. The reptiles also had skin, because of their scales, that wasn't nearly as, it didn't dry out like the amphibian skin did. It had some structural defense because it was tougher. It wasn't as easy to penetrate. They had nails. They had water-conserving kidneys. They had really big lungs. They couldn't breathe through their skin, but all in all, they were much more well advanced and adapted to living on land in different habitats. Here you see that amnion around the embryo. So the reptiles as a whole, there are a few orders we need to discuss. The testudines are the turtles. They have a bony shell. Their limbs that articulate internally to their ribs, even though it doesn't look like it. It looks like they're attached to that shell, but they're not. They actually have a beak rather than teeth. Their shell is made out of the carapace, which is the back side of their shell, and the plastron, which is what you would probably call the stomach side, or the downside of their shell. And they are oviparous, so they are egg layers. So here you see the carapace and the plastron. This is what would cover the underside of the turtle. The order, the crocodilians, includes the alligators, the crocodiles, the gavials, and the caimans. Their openings in front of their eyes, they do have triangular eye orbits rather than oval or round. They're laterally compressed teeth. They're laterally compressed bodies, which means that it looks like someone stepped on them, and they have teeth rather than a beak. They do have a secondary palate, which, I thought I had a picture of, but I don't. It means that there's not as much opening to the back of their throat. And they are oviparous with parental care, though. Most of the turtles and a lot of the other reptiles don't have parental care, but it's very common in the crocodilians to have parental care. The sphenodonts are an unusual and a very small group. These are the tuaterans. They have 2 rows of teeth. They look a lot like an iguana in appearance, but they have 2 rows of teeth. They also have a third parietal eye. It's covered by skin, but it's there. They're off an island, New Zealand, and they are oviparous. Okay, the squamates actually includes the lizards and the snakes. Why? Because both of these groups have a kinetic skull, which means that they can move their jawbones around and displace it if necessary. So the suborder Sauria, those are the lizards, usually 2 pairs of legs, and I do say usually because it includes the worm lizards and the glass lizards. Some of them are oviparous, some of them are ovoviviparous, and some of them are viviparous, so they go the gamut. These jaws unite secondarily, so they do have a kind of kinetic skull, but they no longer displace their jaw. Then we have the suborder Serpentines. These are the snakes. They are legless. They have a skull that's adapted for swallowing large prey. What does that mean? It means they can displace their jaw. So they pop it out of its socket, swallow, pop it back in by yawning. Most of them are oviparous. The group reptiles. Their skin is very thick, it's dry, and it's keratinized. So there's keratin in their skin. Their scales may be modified for other purposes, and their skin has to be shed. So at some point in their development, the skin blood supply is cut off to that outer layer of skin. It dries up and they have to shed it. Their skeleton is highly ossified. It's very rigid. It's hard. They do have additional cervical vertebrae, and they do have 2 or more sacral vertebrae. Most of them are carnivorous. Some of the turtles can be herbivores or omnivorous, but most of the reptiles are carnivorous. Of course, some of the iguanas as well. Their tongues are an interesting thing. They're classified according to whether or not they're protrusible. What that means is that they can stick out their tongues. So lizards and snakes stick out their tongues. Turtles and crocodilians do not. Here's a chameleon, which sticks out its tongue a great distance. Feeding adaptations of snakes. Bones of the upper jaw are movable. The ligaments are therefore loosely joined, and the posterior, some of their teeth are pointed a different direction. The glottis in the mouth of a snake is very far forward, as opposed to in the amphibians, where you find it in the back of the mouth. It has to be in the front of the mouth because some of the snakes, it takes a significant amount of time for them to swallow their prey. If the glottis, which is how they get oxygen into their lungs, was in the back of their mouth, they'd suffocate. So it's in the front. In the vipers, they have a hinged maxillary bone because of, again, some of the size of their prey. And of course, there are venom glands in some that are modified salivary glands. Their venom is something that they metabolically manufacture, as opposed to some of the toxins in the amphibians, which are metabolic, leftover metabolic effects of just common metabolic activities. The venom in the snakes and is intentionally manufactured, and it's incredibly toxic. But it allows the snakes to attack and then back off and then go approach their prey later so that they risk minimal physical damage. Here you see capture of food. This is a copperhead. That's a small prey item there. Circulation, gas exchange, and temperature regulation. The heart is reduced. The sinus venosus is reduced to a pacemaker, except in the turtles. So just something that regulates heart rhythm. The 2 atria, and they have an incompletely divided ventricle, except in the crocodilians. The reptiles are still exothermic. They're still regulating their body temperature behaviorally. They also do not have a high metabolic rate, and so things can be a little sloppy and they can still be successful. If you bring in a very high metabolic rate, the demands on your body are much higher. So you have to have a completely divided ventricle and get more specific about things, and there's just not a lot of time for slop and for mistakes. The crocodilians, that completely divided ventricle, is because they spend most of their time in their water. So it's very important for them to make sure that they keep oxygenated and deoxygenated blood separated, because they're not always going to be above water. Gas exchange. Lungs are like little sponges. There's not a lot of specific points for oxygen exchange. There is negative pressure ventilation, so posterior movement of the ribs and the body wall expands the body cavity. That does have to be modified in turtles, of course, because they are restricted by their shell. And then decreased body pressure is what draws air into the lungs. When you get to mammals and mammals only, you have a diaphragm, and that's what controls air in and air out of the lungs. But anything before that, you've got to have specific ways and means of getting oxygen into lungs. Most of them are ectothermic. You've got some funky things going on with Indian pythons, but very odd. Behavioral regulation is going to depend on sunning yourself, putting yourself on warm rocks, or going into the burrow, or becoming nocturnal if you live in a really hot environment. You can also pant or take the blood to the skin if you're basking, so that you're diverting blood to where your body needs to warm up. If you are in a cold season in temperate climates, some reptiles will enter what's called a hibernacula. What that means is that many of them group together. They're not going into hibernation, but they group together and rotate this massive ball of reptiles until the season ends. The brain's similar to other vertebrates. Sensory function, their vision is good. They do move their lens back and forth. Most for the snakes, in order to focus, other reptiles will actually change lens shape. I mentioned the parietal eye in the tuateras. Hearing is limited. Snakes and some of the other reptiles will actually lay their jaw on the surface of the ground so that amplifies vibrations. Crocodiles actually communicate quite a bit with vocalizations, but that is not necessarily the norm. Other sensory functions, olfaction is common. They use Jacobson organs to pick them up. They are able to use pit organs for heat sensitivity. That is because the snakes, especially because most of their prey items are endothermic, and so they can track them with heat. Some of the sea turtles have magnetic sensory capabilities so that they're successful in their migration. Excretion and osmotic regulation. They do have metanephritic kidneys. They excrete uric acid. They're able to reduce water loss with their respiratory surfaces being internal rather than a large, such as in the amphibians where their skin is a respiratory surface. In order to conserve water, some of them, the nocturnal habits assist, especially in the hot environments, or they can burrow if it's hot. Some of them will store water in their bladder or among the lymphatic system. There are spaces in which they can store water as well. Reproduction and development, internal fertilization, and an amniotic egg makes development from external sources possible. There is an intermittent organ called an hemipenes, which is a double penis. It's like a branching penis, and in the snakes and the lizards, only one side of it would be used, but it does branch. In some of the lizards and the snakes, they are capable of parthenogenesis. For example, the whiptail lizards, all of them are female. They have to encounter another female in order to fertilize their eggs, but there's no transfer of genetic material. They fertilize their own and then produce viable offspring that are clones. Courtship behaviors are common among these individuals, reptiles in general, and the eggs usually develop unattended by a parent. Alligators and a few others are the exceptions. This is a gecko, baby gecko, and a American alligator tending a nest.